Okay, I guess we can begin. Good morning.
Good morning.
Our last day together. Everyone's excited about the examinations. Okay, so yesterday we began speaking about gender as a background to the conflict we're going to talk about today. And I said I want to give you a midrash on gender. So this isn't really, strictly speaking, part of a history course, but I can't resist. So here's my midrash on gender. As I said, there is no society without gender. It's different in every society. It's flexible, it changes, it moves, but it's always there. I mean, it's a paradox. There's always gender, but it's always changing, it's always different. However, let's look at the creation story in the book of Genesis in the Bible. And verse 27 says, "Then God said, let us make the human in our image." Now in Hebrew it says Adam, which is usually translated as man, but being politically correct, I'm translating it as human. In our image, according to our likeness. So there's something divine about the human being. It's the image of God. It's not God, but the image of God. Something less than God. So God created the human in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over every living thing that moves on the earth." Note, no difference between male and female except that they're male and female, biological difference. But God speaks to both of them. He gives them both the same commandment. There's no difference between them. The only difference is the physical difference, male and female. But there's no gender. There's no gender yet, according to the first creation story. And note, at the end of the first creation story, the end of the first chapter of Genesis, in Hebrew, Breshit, the end of the first chapter, what does God say? And God said, "See, I have given you," and again, you here is plural, male and female. I've given both of you. "Every herb that yields seed, which is on the face of all the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed, to you it shall be for food." You, both of you. No difference. Then, at the very end of the creation, at the end of the sixth day, before the Sabbath, the seventh day, God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. In Hebrew, tov me'od. Tov me'od. You probably know those words. Okay? It was very good. So, God created a world that was tov me'od. And this world had no gender. The world of tov me'od had no gender. Then what happened? The people in this world ruined it. How did they ruin it?
Eat apple.
Not an apple. It doesn't say apple. Apple was in the medieval paintings in Europe because it says fruit. Pre is fruit. They ate the fruit of the tree of knowledge. It's not an apple. There were no apples then. The Garden of Eden was somewhere in the Middle East. They didn't have apples. Okay? So they disobeyed. They wrecked it. and God punishes them. And interesting what the punishment is. To the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. What do we call that? Gender hierarchy. And then to Adam he said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree, cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. A man is supposed to work hard and earn the money. What's that? Gender. In other words, gender is a punishment. We're stuck with it, just like we're stuck with pain in childbirth, and we're stuck with having to work hard, and we're stuck with gender hierarchy. It's a punishment. Okay, that's Rosman's midrash on gender. Now, let's get back to history. In traditional societies, there was always a basic assumption. It is better for a woman to be attached to a man than not to be attached, either as the daughter or as the wife. A single woman is in a very precarious, dangerous situation. So it's always better to be attached than not to be attached. And again, let's have an example from the Bible. The book of Deuteronomy. In Hebrew, Devarim. The book of Devarim. If a man comes upon a virgin, and he seizes her, and lies with her, and they are discovered, the man who lay with her shall pay the girl's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife. So, a man rapes a girl. And what's his punishment? He has to marry her. Because he has violated her, he can never have the right to divorce her. Not only does he have to marry her, he can never divorce her. What's wrong with this picture?
Don't ask the wife.
The girl? What about her? She is forced to marry her rapist? Now I will say the rabbis later said no, that she can refuse. But it seems that the original text is telling us it's to her advantage, because what happened? Now that she's raped, her value on the marriage market is way down. So her chances of getting married are very slim. This is it. And again, what's the assumption here? The assumption behind this is better to be attached to a man than not to be attached. Even so, better to be attached to your rapist than not to be attached. That is how important it is. You know, when you're studying history and you're reading a source, when it doesn't make sense to you, or when you don't get the joke, or when you don't understand how could they think this way, that's where you enter into the history. Because that's where obviously they're different from us. And this is a great example. Because somebody today reads this and says, hey, wait a minute, what about the woman? So obviously there's something going on here that's different from our society. And the difference is they believed very profoundly better to be attached than not attached. Okay, now also in Jewish culture, in the early modern period, not only Jewish culture, but we're talking about Jewish culture, there are what I would call two governing stereotypes about women. When people talk about women, they often talk in terms of two stereotypes. They talk first of all about nashim. You probably know that word in Hebrew already, nashim. Isha, nashim. Women. When you talk about women, that term carries with it certain overtones, implications, which we'll talk about in a minute. The second term is nashim v'amei haaretz. Nashim v'amei haaretz. Now, amei haaretz is plural of am haaretz. Does anybody know what am haaretz means?
Simple.
What?
Simple.
I can't hear you.
Simple.
Simple people, uneducated people. Literally, it means people of the land. But what it really means is uneducated people, ignoramuses, people who don't know anything. That's an am haaretz. So you find this phrase, nashim v'amei haaretz, as a figure of speech throughout rabbinic literature. In other words, women and amei haaretz go together. Why?
They don't read Torah.
What?
They don't read Torah.
They're not educated. Women and amei haaretz are not educated. Okay. Now, but each of these terms, nashim on the one hand, nashim v'amei haaretz on the other hand, has a different meaning. If you just talk about nashim, you're referring to women as what we might call facilitators. You know what I mean by facilitator? How would you say that in Ukrainian? Somebody who makes something happen, who helps something happen, is a facilitator. Okay? Somebody who makes sure that other people can do what they're supposed to do or get what they're supposed to get. That's a facilitator. Women are, first of all, facilitators. So when you say nashim, you're talking about women as facilitators, women as making sure that somebody else, men, are able to accomplish what they're supposed to accomplish. So, in the Talmud already, in the tractate Brachot, in the Talmud, we have a classic statement of what a woman is supposed to be like. Nashim, women. How do women gain merit? How do women get credit from God? By bringing their sons to the synagogue to learn Torah, and by sending their husbands to the study hall and waiting for them until they come home from the study hall. In other words, women don't go to study Torah, women don't go to the study hall, but they make it possible for their sons and husbands to go, so that is their contribution. That's what I call facilitating. They make sure that when her husband comes home, he's got his hot supper waiting for him. They make sure the children get up on time, get dressed, have their breakfast, send them out to school. They don't have to go to school. And children, in this case, we're talking about sons. Now, more than 1,000 years later, we still have the same idea. Somebody we've already met before, the Ramah, or Ramu, who's that? Remember who that is? Rabbi of Krakow, Moshe Isserlis, Moshe Isserlis. In Hebrew, Rav Moshe Isserlis Rav, Moshe, Isserlis gives us Ramah in a Krakow accent, I would say Ramu. And this is, by the way, many rabbis, classic rabbis, are referred to by their initials like this. So, what did he say? And he lived in the 16th century. The Talmud, we're talking about the 5th century. 1,000 years later, what does Moshe Isserlis say? If she, that is, if a woman helps her son or her husband occupy themselves with Torah, she shares the reward with them. So again, a woman doesn't have to occupy herself with Torah. She has to make sure that her menfolk study Torah, and then she gets the reward. So what is her job? Facilitation. That's what a woman does. She makes it possible for men to fulfill their obligations. That's her obligation. And then we have Nashim v'Amei Haaretz. What are Nashim and Amei Haaretz? Now, Amei Haaretz are not facilitators. So what are they? Well, when you get this phrase, Nashim v'Amei Haaretz, what you're talking about is observers. In cultural terms, these people are observers as opposed to performers or actors. They watch other people perform the cultural acts. So, for example, in the Talmud again, it says, in Talmud, we're talking about 5th, 6th century, right? A foreigner who heard the Megillah in Hebrew has fulfilled his obligation. It says in the Mishnah that if somebody comes to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, doesn't know Hebrew, and listens to the Megillah, what Megillah are we talking about? What Megillah?
Torah?
I can't hear you.
It's a little scroll.
What?
Torah scroll? Little scroll.
What? No, but this is a certain specific scroll. Which scroll? When I say the Megillah, what am I talking about?
Travel.
No. The book of Esther, Megillah Esther, Purim, the holiday of Purim. The holiday of Purim, you must hear the reading of the Megillat Esther, the story of Esther and Mordechai. So, what this says is, the Mishnah says, if somebody comes from outside Eretz Yisrael, does not know Hebrew, and hears the Megillah read in Hebrew, they have fulfilled their obligation. So, the Talmud, the Gemara, objects and says, but he does not know what they're saying. How can you say that somebody who just heard it in Hebrew without understanding has fulfilled his obligation? You can't just sit there and hear the noise of the reading. You have to understand what they're reading. No. It is like the case of women and ignorant men. It's like women and Amei Haaretz. Also women and Amei Haaretz. If they don't understand, that's okay. They don't have to understand. They just have to listen. That's what I mean by observers rather than performers. They don't have to actually read it. They don't have to understand it. They just have to be there. That's what the Talmud said in the 5th century. But it changes. It changes. In the 13th century, we had a custom that developed that when they read the Torah on Shabbat, they read it in Hebrew and also in Aramaic, because Aramaic was the language that people spoke. And an Italian rabbi, Yehuda ben Binyamin HaRofeh Anav, in his book, Shibolei HaLeket, wrote, The whole point of translation is to explain words of Torah to the women and the unlearned men who don't understand Hebrew. Aha! A change. If in the Talmud they said they don't understand, they don't have to understand. In the Middle Ages they're saying no, they should understand. And we're going to make it possible for them to understand. How? By translating. So in other words, they're moving from being just observers to being more of performers. And then when we get to the 16th century, this I already mentioned to you, this book by Moshe Altshuler called The Brandspiegel, published 1596, I think it is. 1596, wrote on the title page in Yiddish. This book is written in Yiddish for women and for men who are like women and not being able to learn much. Nashim va'amei haaretz. In other words, by the 16th century they're saying women must be educated. Women must know what does it mean to be a Jew. What is a Jew supposed to do? But not just women, also amei haaretz, also uneducated men. So we have a shift from this category of people, Nashim v'amei haaretz, from being just observers to becoming performers or actors. Okay? If you have a question, ask. Now, let's get back to problems that every society has to solve, but they solve it in different ways. So one problem is, how do you establish new families? You have to get the people together, right? You have to make matches. You have to give them some kind of economic base. You have to house them. How do you do that? And every society has different ways of doing it. As you know, I was born in America. I grew up in Chicago. So how did we do it then? So matchmaking is done by the young people themselves, by dating, and eventually you fall in love and decide you're going to get married. At that point, the parents get involved. But in America, the only obligation the parents have is to make the wedding. Who's going to support you? Aha. The parents have a different obligation, education. In America, everyone believes if you have education, you'll be able to make a good living. So the parents' obligation is to make sure you go to college. And college, everyone believes, with a true faith, is the ticket to the middle class. So parents don't have to do anything else. They have to send you to college. You are obligated to go to college, learn something, be able to get a good job, and support yourself. And if you can't, then you have no business getting married. Okay? That's the way they do it in America. I don't know how they do it here. I know how they do it in Israel. But I don't want to spend time now going through that. But it's different from America. In Israel, the parents do have obligations. Tell me about it. So, every society has to find a way to establish new families. One way is the bride price, what we saw before from the book of Devarim. Bride price means the groom pays for the bride. A different and more recent development, recent, but I mean about 2,000 years, is the dowry. The bride brings the money into the marriage. And the dowry is the economic base for the couple. The bride brings the money in, and that's the couple's capital. That will determine their standard of living. If they have a small dowry, then they have a small house. They have a big dowry, they have a big house. They have a big dowry, they can invest money in a business. So the dowry is the key to the couple's standard of living. Another problem, inheritance. Now in Jewish law, halakha, you know that term, halakha? It's a central term in Jewish culture, Jewish law, halakha. I should write it on the board. Halakha. In principle, according to the classic Jewish law from the Torah, women do not inherit. Only men inherit. Only sons inherit, not daughters. Of course, there's a famous case in the Bible itself of the daughters of Tzlafchad, 5 daughters who say, our father died, he only had daughters, why should we lose his property just because he didn't have any sons? He didn't do anything wrong. And this is such a problem that Moshe, doesn't even know the answer. He has to go to God. What should we do if there are no sons? And thank God he says, okay, if there are no sons, the daughters can have the property. And until very recently, there still was one very important family in this world that followed exactly the Torah rule. You know which family that was? Now it's not like that anymore. The British royal family. If there are sons, the sons become the king. If there are no sons, then the daughter becomes the king. Queen, excuse me. Okay? But now they changed it. It goes to the oldest child, whoever it is. They've become liberated. So, but in Jewish law, we still have this problem. Daughters do not inherit. If there are sons, daughters don't get anything. Well, believe it or not, a lot of parents want their daughters to get something. So this problem is, how can we work it out anyway that daughters will inherit, despite what the Torah says? So there are various solutions. One solution is to set up a trust fund, what we would call a trust fund today, for the daughter. That is that the father says the daughter is entitled to half whatever a son would get. Why only half? Because the assumption is that the daughter is getting a dowry, and that's really part of her inheritance. So the dowry plus half whatever her brothers are getting should make it roughly equal. Or, while he's alive, he gives her money. Or, the father loans his daughter money, and in his will he says, I forgive the loan. She doesn't owe her brothers anything. She doesn't owe the estate. Or a gift, a grant a gift, the same thing. Or legislation. There are Jewish communities throughout history that have simply made a rule. Daughters do inherit. In our community, daughters inherit. That's it. Okay, so now we're getting back to Moshe Isserlis, our favorite rabbi. As I've said to you before, a member of the Rabbinic All-Star team. What is he most famous for? I see we're headed for a train wreck this afternoon. What is he most famous for? Remember the Shulchan Aruch? We talked about the code of Jewish law. And there are two parts to it, the Ashkenazic and the Sephardic. Which part did he write? The Ashkenazic. He wrote the Ashkenazic part of the standard code of Jewish law, the Shulchan Aruch. So, he's an important rabbi. But that's not what we're talking about today. Rabbis also traditionally write what you call in English responsa. That is, responses to questions. People, often other rabbis, will write to an important rabbi and say, we have the following halachic problem, what should we do? And he responds to the question. So that's called a responsum. In Hebrew, we call it shoot, which is an abbreviation. And as you know by now, Hebrew is full of abbreviations, acronyms. She'elot u'tshuvot. She'elot u'tshuvot, questions and answers. So a responsum is an answer to a question. In short, we say shoot. Now, the Ramah, as a very important rabbi, answered many questions. After he died, many of his responsa were put together in a book. He didn't do it. I think it's his grandson actually who did it. And responsum number 125 is very interesting. And that's our subject, the subject of our conflict now. Again, to understand the responsum, you have to understand the idea of marriage capital. We can talk about marriage capital. In other words, what is of value to the candidate for marriage? There are three kinds of marriage capital. There are three things that make you an attractive prospective husband or wife. One is money. If you have money, that's good. Second is family. If you come from an important family, whether they have money or not. Prestige. Power. And third is scholarship. If you come from a family of scholars, or if yourself, you are a scholar. This is marriage capital. Money, family, scholarship. And of course, there's a calculus here. If you have more money, you need less family. If you have more scholarship, you need less money. Okay? But each of these things is a source of marriage capital. Remember, marriages are arranged, usually by the parents. Often there is somebody, a matchmaker, called in Hebrew shadchan, somebody who makes the match. This can be a man or a woman, depending on where we are and when we're talking about. But marriages are arranged. The assumption, again, is first comes marriage, then comes love. We assume the opposite, of course. Right? First love, then marriage. But they assumed, let's put it this way, it's not that the person I married is the only one for me. What they assumed is there is a very large number of people I could marry. By the time the marriage ends, by death, not divorce, of course, then it should be she's the only person for me or he's the only person for me. That's what we work towards, not what we work from. That's the assumption. So first marriage, then love. Now, marriage age. Marriage age is something that is extremely variable. We can say that in the period we're talking about, parents wanted their children to get married young, teenage. They wanted them to get married young, and if they could, very young, like 12, 13. However, only rich people could marry off 11, 12, 13-year-olds. Why?
Because they have money. Money and resources.
Because you have to support these young children. They can't support themselves. So it's really a kind of adoption. If you marry off your 11-year-old daughter to a 13-year-old boy, what you're really doing is adopting a 13-year-old. You've got to clothe him and feed him and take care of him. All that takes money. It's having another child. So it's only rich people who got married at a very young age. You know, if you read stories, you get the impression sometimes, oh, everybody got married at bar mitzvah. No. Maybe that was an ideal. I mean, what's good about that? Why do you want your child to get married so young? Because it's really a form of social control. When you marry off somebody so young, that's it, they're locked in. They can't go off to India and smoke pot. They're going to do pretty much what the parents say. Every once in a while there's going to be somebody who rebels, yes. But in general, by marrying them off young, that's a form of social and cultural insurance. Okay, but most people in the period we're talking about could not afford to marry off such young children. We're talking of ideal age in practice was for girls 16, 17, 18, for boys 18, 19, 20. With, of course, a lot of variation. And there's something called Kest, from the German word Kust. In English we would say cost. That is, when you do marry off young children, one of the families agrees to Kest, agrees to foot the cost of supporting the couple. And depending on where we are, that's which family will do it. In Germany, it could be either the bride's family or the groom's family. In Poland, and when I say Poland, I mean big Poland, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, it was almost always the bride's family. The groom would join the bride's family. And then, as I said, the dowry. When we're talking about a situation that's not Kest, there's a dowry. The size of the dowry is going to determine the level, the standard of living of the couple. That is their initial capital to start out in life. Okay, so now, Moshe Isserlis, Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, wrote a responsum that's not a responsum. This is not an answer to a question. This is not an answer to a question. Instead, it is a defense of something he did. He did something very controversial. And people are whispering about it. Now, he was a prominent rabbi, so they couldn't fire him But there was a lot of murmuring. Did he do the right thing? How did he dare do it? How could he do it? And he's aware of this. So he decides he's going to issue a public explanation defending what he did. And this gives us some insight into our controversy. Would anybody like to read the English? For everybody else, read it out loud. Please.
And
Real loud.
and I have heard great noise about me making the round saying, look at that Moshe, concerning an act I recently did, performing a marriage as is conventional.
Okay, so he's saying there's a lot of noise going around. People are saying, look at what he did, look what he did. He performed a marriage. Okay, big deal, he performed a marriage. But, go ahead.
But it was in the middle of the night, on the Shabbat, Friday night, about an hour and a half into the night.
Oh! Now, you are not allowed to get married on Shabbat. Why not? Because the marriage ceremony is basically a business deal. There's a ketubah. What's the ketubah? Marriage contract. It's an agreement between the bride and the groom. And you're not allowed to conclude a contract on Shabbat. Now, how did we get to this, that people are getting married on Shabbat? The answer is, in many Jewish communities in the period we're talking about, and even later, and I should add today in Israel, it's very common for similar reasons, people would get married on Friday afternoon. In Israel, they get married Friday morning. But in these kind of communities, in Krakow in the 16th century, they got married Friday afternoon. Why? Because Friday people take off early from work anyway. So they take off early to go to the wedding. Secondly, they didn't invite hundreds of people to the wedding. I don't know what the custom is here. In Israel, I've been at weddings with 800 people. They didn't invite 800 or even 100. They invited 20 people, 30 people to a wedding. So, why is that funny? How many do you invite?
It depends. So,
What would be considered normal?
100.
100, 200?
No. Right now there is no normal
Okay.
quantity. So recently when my parents got married, it was about 60 people.
Okay.
60 up to.
All right, so that's double. And also you save money on the meal, because Shabbat you need a fancy meal anyway. So this way, the Shabbat meal is the wedding meal. You make it a little bigger because you have guests, but you're saving money. So it was very traditional to have the wedding right before Shabbat, and the celebration, the meal, the singing, the dancing after Shabbat started. And in some cases, they even hired non-Jewish musicians to play during the meal after Shabbat. Okay? But in this case, they were supposed to get married Erev Shabbat, right before Shabbat, but for the reason we'll see, it was delayed. An hour and a half into Shabbat, finally, he could do the ceremony. It's already Shabbat. So a lot of people are saying he should have said, well, let's wait till Sunday. Let's wait till Saturday night. He didn't. He went ahead and performed the wedding on Shabbat. Go ahead.
And the action and the reason I had to do is here explained, set out for error.
Okay, so now he's going to explain to us why he did it. And he has a long halachic explanation, which we're not going to go into. You know, very complicated halachic reasoning, why even though normally we don't do it, in this case it was okay to do it. You don't have to know that. If you're interested, someday we may study it. What we're interested in here is what exactly happened. And here's what happened. Please.
There was a man with no
A
money.
little louder.
There was a man with no money who matched his mature daughter with a proper match. But during the engagement, as the time stretched until the wedding, their father died. And the daughter was left alone,
Bereft.
bereft with neither father nor mother.
Okay, so she is an orphan.
Yeah.
And we can assume she was 16, 17, 18 years old, something like that.
Only relatives who distanced themselves from her and looked away
Why did they distance themselves from her?
because
She's to be the bride and
money.
They didn't want to have to
Yeah.
cough up the money. They were afraid if they were nice to her, she would say, well, will you help me? And they didn't want to, so they just avoided her.
Except
And we're talking about uncles, aunts, cousins, right?
except one redeemer who must her mother.
Okay, one uncle agreed to be her redeemer. The knight in shining armor. He was going to save her.
As the time for marriage approached, when the food and other necessities of the wedding should be prepared, she did not see any sign of a dowry
Or of
of
any.
any of the accessories.
Okay, we're getting close to the wedding. We need a dowry. Her father, you remember, her father had made a deal with the groom or the groom's family what the dowry would be. Plus, you need things when you get married. She needs a dress, you need food, you need, and nothing's happening.
There was but one word that told her to immerse in the...
Okay, brides have to go to the mikveh, to the ritual bath before they get married. That's one of the things you do before you get married, you go to the mikveh. So she didn't know, should I do it or shouldn't? Is there going to be a wedding or not? So one of her relatives said to her, yes, go.
And to prepare herself for the wedding because she would have a dowry.
We're going to take care of it. You're going to have your dowry.
And this girl did whatever the neighbor woman did, her to, told her to. He didn't
All right, she didn't have a mother, so the neighbors said, okay, here's what you have to do to get ready for the mikveh, get ready for the wedding.
On Friday, they also covered her with a veil as is customary for a virgin.
In other words, if a woman is getting married for the first time, she wears a veil. The Jewish custom is if she's a widow or a divorcee, she doesn't wear a veil. Only women who are getting married for the first time wear a veil. Okay?
As the shadows fell and it was almost Shabbat, when her relatives were supposed to produce the dowry, their hands closed. And the dowry was shot almost, sorry.
Okay. What happened here? The relatives figured, we'll wait till the last minute when we're supposed to have the wedding. It's right before Shabbat. And we'll come to the groom and say, okay, here's the money. And he'll say, well, wait a minute, you're short. This is it, that's what's going to be. Take it or leave it. And they figured he would take it. But
The groom also stepped back and absolutely refused to marry her. Ignoring everything the leaders of the community were telling him, not to humiliate a daughter of Israel over contemptible money.
yes, in other words, the leaders of the community are saying, look, you're embarrassing this girl. For what? For money? Much more important is to get married and not to leave her at the altar, so to speak, or we would say under the chuppah, right?
But he didn't want to listen. He just shut his ears like a deep viper, refusing
Snakes are deaf, right?
refusing to hear the sounds and even the
Rebuking.
rebuking voice of the sage.
In other words, the rabbi, he wouldn't listen to the rabbi either.
Yeah.
Okay? This guy says, sorry, we made a deal. I had a deal with the father. I'm getting X amount. Either give it to me or no marriage, no chuppah.
Thus the time dragged on with fighting and early on fight until the
Aforementioned.
aforementioned hour when they reached agreement and the groom agreed to come under the wedding.
Okay, so finally, they came to an agreement. Somebody decided to give him the money, whatever happened. And he said, okay, I'll come under the chuppah.
So as not to humiliate a decent daughter of Israel, I arose and performed the wedding at that late hour.
Okay, so Shabbat started a long time ago, doesn't matter, he performed the wedding. Okay. Again, what's wrong with this picture? When we see this, what's the first question that gets into our mind? Well, maybe not in yours. Who's missing from this story? The girl. If you were supposed to get married and your groom said, I'm not marrying her unless I get my money, what would you do? I know what my daughters would do. You say, hell with you, I'm not marrying you. That's what's important to you, the money? But she doesn't say a word. And she goes ahead with the wedding, obviously. So again, when you find a place where you don't understand why people behave the way they behave, that's where we are going to begin to understand this society. Okay. For the groom, his considerations are ideal considerations versus pragmatic ones. The ideal, of course, is everybody should be married, have children, establish a home. We say in Israel, we don't mean physical Israel, we mean the people of Israel. Establish a home in the Jewish people versus the pragmatic. Again, this money is not intended for him to go on a vacation or to spend it at the bar. This money is supposed to be the capital base for this new family. And he knows that if it's a third less, then their standard of living is going to be a third less. He's not going to college. He doesn't have the opportunity to start a career where he's going to gradually make more and more money. He's got to start out at a certain level. The initial decision is what's going to determine his income. Oh, and there's no sanction. You cannot, in Jewish law, you cannot force someone to get married. A person must agree to marry both girl and boy. You cannot force someone to get married. Now, of course, you can put all kinds of pressure on them as they try to here. But if in the end they refuse, okay. So there's no sanction. They can't threaten him with anything. They can only appeal. Now, what about the bride? For her, it's a question of honor versus pragmatism. On the one hand, as the elders and the rabbi were saying to him, you're humiliating her. Because if she doesn't get married, it's an embarrassment. Here she is, she's all set to go, she's under the chuppah, you know. And we have all these stories in many cultures, left at the altar. It's an embarrassment, it's humiliation. And if she decides to marry him after all this, in our eyes, it's also humiliation. But for her, it's also pragmatic. First of all, if she didn't get married that night, what would happen to her value in the marriage market? It would go way down. It doesn't matter what the reason was that she didn't get married. The fact is, she was there all set to get married, the groom refused to marry her. There must be something wrong with her. Maybe what's wrong with her, she doesn't have enough money, okay. She doesn't have enough marriage capital. So her value on the marriage market goes way down. She's an orphan.
I'm sorry, does the groom go down in the marriage?
The groom,
Rome
No.
is always
a little bit, not as much as the
As a
bride.
bride.
Somewhat. And secondly, this is her standard of living too. The money is not just for him. The money is for the couple. She has an interest in there being as high a dowry as possible for her. It's not like she's giving the money to him and she'll never see it again. The money is to be used for the family. So she really has an interest in him holding out for the money. Now, what about the bride's family? Well, the bride's family, on the one hand, since she is an orphan, they have a responsibility towards her. But on the other hand, they have to pay money. They don't want to do that. So they're going to try to get away with paying as little as possible and still fulfill their responsibility. They're trying to balance their responsibility with how much it's going to cost them. And what about the rabbi? Well, the rabbi, on the one hand, he has to weigh his obligation to uphold the law, which is you don't get married on Friday night, versus there's another obligation in Jewish law. There's something called kvod habriot. Kvod habriot. Kavod means honor. Riot, creatures. We're talking about human creatures. Human dignity. There is an idea in Jewish law of kvod habriot, human dignity. People should not be forced to lose their dignity. And in certain cases, you can violate halakha to protect a person's dignity. And the Ramah is saying this is such a case. That in this case, the dignity of the bride, not to be humiliated, is more important than the prohibition against marrying on Shabbat. Plus, he says there are all sorts of exceptions to the rule anyway. This should also be an exception. But he also has another consideration. His prestige and authority. If he does something like this, which is fairly radical, to perform a wedding on Shabbat, if he can get away with it, this makes him all the more authoritative and prestigious. Because it's easy to say no. When you're talking about law, it's always, especially halakha, it's always easy to say no. Not allowed to do it. That's the easy answer. The hard answer is to say yes. So if he can say yes in this case and get away with it, then that increases his own stature, his prestige, his authority. So he has to decide, is it worth the risk? Because as we see, he did it and people were complaining about him. So it was a risk. Is this going to hurt me or help me? So that's also in the calculus here. Okay, so let's look at our table. The bride, the groom, the family, the rabbi. What are their interests? Well, the bride's interest is status, to be married, security, and she wants children. The groom also wants status, security, and children. They both want the same thing. The family wants good relations but no responsibility. That's their interest. We should all love each other, go on picnics together, get together for the holidays, but keep your hands out of my pocket. I'll give you a gift for your wedding. The Ramu wants to observe the norms of halakha. I mean, he is the standard bearer. He wants to create new families, and he also wants to preserve his position. The bride wants to get married. We're talking now of her objective. Her objective is to get married and to have maximum dowry. The groom wants the maximum dowry and to get married. You notice how I think their objectives are slightly different, or different emphasis. The family, well, they want them to get married at the lowest possible cost. The rabbi wants it to be a legitimate marriage. He also wants not to embarrass the bride, and he also wants to strengthen his position. So he has three objectives. So what's their strategy? The bride's strategy is passivity. No, that's her tactic. Her strategy is depend on others. She's going to depend on her uncle and her relatives. They're going to take care of it. That's her strategy. Let them take care of it. The groom, he constructs a zero-sum game. He structures the situation so that either you win or I win. The family wants to create facts on the ground. Fait accompli. Here's the money. Take it or leave it, assuming he's going to take it. You know, in my family, they always tell the story. My father made his living, he was partners with his brother in a gas station in Chicago. They started when they were very young. My father was 21 or 22. My uncle was 19. And their father bought the building that was the gas station. And when he bought it, whatever the price was, I don't know, he wrote out a check. He said, "This is what I'm paying you." And the family story is the guy took it. So when they see the money, they'll take it, even though it was obviously lower than he was demanding. So that's what this family is trying to do, the same kind of thing. So that's their strategy. Fait accompli. And the rabbi, his strategy is also create a fait accompli and test his authority. I'll give you another example of this. I mean, basically what he said is, I'm going to perform the wedding and then I'll figure out the reason why. So, you know, there's a passage in the Talmud that says, on Shabbat, if you see a building has collapsed and you know, or you think that there's a Jew underneath, you have permission to clear away the stones on Shabbat. But if you know there's no Jew there, you have to wait till after Shabbat. Now, the Talmud also says that the Roman emperor studied halakha, studied the Talmud, and he sent, or he didn't study, he had two of his people study the Talmud. And after they finished studying, they went to the rabbis, they said, you know, this Talmud's a pretty good book, except for one thing. This law that you're only allowed to save a Jew on Shabbat, not a non-Jew. That didn't make much sense to us. So there was a professor, a non-Jewish professor at Columbia University, very famous, and a famous Talmud professor up the block at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. His name was Shaul Lieberman, and the professor was Morton Smith, who also studied Talmud. Morton Smith was not Jewish. And he once said to Lieberman, who was a great Talmudist, tell me, Professor Lieberman, if I was under there, what would you do? So what do you think Lieberman said?
He will go for.
Just what the Rambam says. First I'd save you, then I'd find the reason why. First I'd save you, then I'd find the reason why. And that's exactly what he did here. First he's going to save the girl, and then figure out why it's justified. First I'm going to do the right thing. So, what are the tactics? The girl, passivity. Her tactic is do nothing. The boy, he's stubborn, refuse to negotiate. Be a deaf snake. The family, persuasion, appeal to values, not money. What's important in life after all? And the rabbi, his tactic is to be daring, to do something radical, and then to find a legal defense for it. So, this is our conflict of within the family on a very small level. But just like the big conflicts we saw, we have always interests, objectives, strategy, and tactics. Okay, let's go on to the next. Hasidim and Mitnagdim. Hasidism and its opponents. One of the most famous controversies in Jewish history, certainly as famous as Shabtai Tzvi. And has the added advantage is it began where?
Ukraine.
Right here. And again, I'm going to start with background. That's what makes it fun, at least for me. This man is named Shimon Dubnov. Shimon Dubnov. He was a Russian Jew. He lived for a time in Berlin. At the time of the Shoah, he was in Riga, and he was killed in Riga. He was born in 1860 and was killed by the Nazis in 1940 at the age of 80. He is a very important Jewish historian. If in Germany, the generation before him, an older contemporary of his was somebody I've mentioned here before, Tzvi Heinrich Gretz. Gretz was a great German Jewish historian. Dubnov is the great, most people would say, Russian Jewish historian. He wrote in Russian. He also wrote in Hebrew and German, but his language was Russian. And Dubnov, I mean, he wrote many things, and he really is one of the classics of Jewish historiography. Among the books he wrote A History of Hasidism, first in Russian and then in Hebrew, and then it was translated into German. And for many years, the Russian version came out in the 1890s. The Hebrew version came out at the end of the 1920s. More than 20 years, almost 30 years later. But for many years, his conception of what Hasidism was, how Hasidism got started, and how it developed, is what everybody believed. What Dubnov wrote, everybody believed. And he was a pioneer. I mean, he's the one, he gathered the sources, he's the one that published sources, analyzed them. He was the first one to really take Hasidism seriously as a historical phenomenon. Gretz, by the way, also wrote about Hasidism, but he hated Hasidim so much that it was not good history. It was very biased and slanted. Whereas Dubnov, who came from Eastern Europe, made a sincere effort to understand Hasidism. So, what was Dubnov's Hasidism? Dubnov's Hasidism was Hasidism as a response to a crisis in the 18th century. There was a crisis in Jewish life in Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, in the 18th century. And Hasidism came as a response to that crisis. What was the crisis? So, Dubnov said it was a crisis of physical security. Jews were in danger. Why? Blood libels. He said that in the first half of the 18th century there was a frenzy of blood libels. Every other year there was a blood libel. And life became intolerable. So, if you feel physically unsafe, you feel persecuted, but you can't go anywhere, what is your response? You turn to spirituality. If you can't find security in everyday life, you turn to God for security. And that was Hasidism, a form of pietism, a form of spirituality. And Dubnov said there was, first of all, what he called the classic movement, the movement that began in the second quarter of the 18th century, in the 1740s. And this movement had three generations. The first generation was Ba'al Shem Tov, Yisrael Ba'al Shem Tov. He was the first generation. He started this movement. Then the second generation was the Ba'al Shem Tov's disciples. Now the Ba'al Shem Tov died in 1760. He was active as a Hasid from about 1740. 1740 to 20 years. 1740 to 1760. He started this movement. He died. His outstanding disciples, Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezerich. Maggid means a preacher. The preacher of, in Polish you say Międzyrzecz. Międzyrzecz, I don't know what it is in Ukrainian.
Mazhirich.
Mazhirich, okay. So in Yiddish it's Mezerich. So to be safe, I'll just use the Yiddish. The Maggid of Mezerich, Yaakov Yosef. In Yiddish it's Polnoya,
Polomna.
Polonia, Polona, and Pinchas of Koretz in Polish. Koretz? Okay. These are the second generation. And according to Dubnov, there was a struggle. Who's going to take over? Who's going to take over the movement? In the end, Dov Ber won the struggle. The third generation is the Dov Ber, or the Maggid's disciples. And his disciples spread the movement out. If the Baal Shem Tov, where was he located? Mezhibush. Yes. Dov Ber moved the center, the headquarters, north to Volyn, to Mezerich, and then later Ruvna. His disciples spread it throughout Ukraine and Belarus. Somebody went to Shklov, and somebody went to Liadi in Belarus today. People who went to different places in Ukraine. And each one started his own court, and that's how the movement spread. And in this period, from 1740 until approximately 1815, by 1815, all of the Maggid's disciples had died. So this period, 1740 to 1815, this period of some 75 years, this is the classic period, this is the creative period of Hasidism. This is when the new ideas of Hasidism were formed, and the new institutions of Hasidism were formed, by which I mean the idea of the Rebbe, or the Tzaddik, that is the head of the court, and the whole idea of a court of the holy man. These all came into being during these 75 years. And then, according to Dubnov, what happened? Or before that, I should say. From the beginning, there was opposition. From the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov, there were people who opposed him, opposed what he was doing, were against this new movement. From the beginning. From the 1740s. And after 1815, Dubnov said, we have degeneration. You have the classic movement, the creative movement, the inspiring movement, until 1815, about, approximately. And after that, until 1870, we have what he called Sabbatianism and the battle with Haskalah. Do you know what Haskalah is? What is it?
It means Jewish enlightenment.
Okay, enlightenment, rationality, turning to non-Jewish sources, making Judaism, Jewishness more modern. Well, Dubnov, of course, was a maskil. He was somebody who wrote in the university style, did research in an academic style. So on one hand, he thought Hasidism was something important and positive, but at some point it had to change because he was a maskil of the 19th century. He didn't get along that well with the Hasidim of his own time. So what he says is, when did the change come? After the students of the Maggid all died, their successors made it into something Tzaddikism. It was personality cult. They weren't creative anymore. They didn't come up with any new ideas, new institutions. all they were interested in was promoting themselves, collecting money from their followers to make sure that they could live in high style, exploiting the masses. And he called the period after 1870 absolute decline, corruption. It was just a racket. It was about money. And of course, after 1870 coincides with Dubnov's own lifetime. So in other words, the Hasidim that I know, they're not nice people, they're not doing anything significant, they're not the future of Judaism. But classic Hasidism of the 18th and early 19th century, that was something important that we can all learn from. That contributed to strengthening Jewish life, Jewish culture, Jewish spirituality, and everybody, including Maskilim, have something to learn from that. Also, people said classic Hasidism was a movement of the people as opposed to the rabbinic establishment, and it defended the common person against the corrupt leaders who were unfair, who collected taxes. And so Hasidism was a movement of the masses as opposed to the elite. So that was Dubnov's Hasidism. Now we'll take a break and come back for Rosman's Hasidism.